welcome to another edition of Mississippi Stories. I'm your host, Marshall Ramsey. I'm editor at large and editorial cartoonist for Mississippi Today. Thanks for joining us today. I think we got a great interview today. We are interviewing that gold record you see there. Actually, it's got a great story behind it and a great person behind it. And I think you're going to really enjoy Ellis Nassour, who is an author, a journalist, a playwright. And I tell you what, sometimes when you write a book, you kind of hope it hangs around for 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years. His book, Honky Tonk Angel, The Intimate Story of Patsy Cline, is almost old enough to be a grandfather at this point because it's been around for about 40 years, and it's a fantastic book. And of course, Ellis, thank you for joining us today. I see you've panned down and now revealed your face, but you got to tell us real quickly, what's the story behind the gold record?
Well, I worked with Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber on developing Jesus Christ Superstar from the recording. And we launched the recording in New York at a church. We called it The Last Supper. And then, of course, there was the concert tour. And then I worked with Michael Shurtleff as assistant casting director for the Broadway show, the tour, and the Los Angeles production, which was totally different from the Broadway production because so many people hated Tom O'Hara's production that Mr. Stigwood, Robert Stigwood, the entrepreneur behind the Bee Gees, he said, we got to have a different show for Los Angeles.
So, okay, what you should just kick this thing off with literally with a home run. That's fantastic. Ellis, I tell you, thank you for joining us today. It's amazing how a kid from Vicksburg, Mississippi, ends up with a gold record behind him and such a great story. And you've gotten to meet so many incredible people in your career and write about them. And of course, your book about Patsy Cline is just, what kills me about the book is the fact that nobody else had written about her before you did.
It was amazing. I was very surprised about that too. The only thing that existed between her death in 1963, and her being named into the Hall of Fame, in the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1973, the liner notes for the Patsy Cline story. So that's when I got the idea that I was working for the company at that time for MCA Universal Studios, and they were looking for ideas to see if we had artists that should get gold records. And of course, there was Bing Crosby and Brenda Lee and a couple of classical artists. And then I ran across the sales for Patsy Cline's records, and I said, this is amazing, and no one's ever given her a gold record. So that's kind of how my interest started. And I did three serials. I did a 3-part. I didn't even know if I would get the book published, and oddly enough, I almost didn't. I did a 3-part series for a Nashville country music newspaper. Turned out that it was owned by Farron Young. So when I got the idea to come down to Nashville and start trying to interview a few people, Farron and Patsy's second husband, Charlie Dick, they started introducing me around everywhere. And one person led to another until we got up to about 125 people that were eventually all interviewed for the book.
Yeah, your access. I mean, you interviewed Jimmy Dean, Jan Howard, Brendan Lee, Loretta Lynn, Roger Miller, Dottie West. I mean, any one of those, I would love to read a book about each one of them too. And you got Dottie West to do the forward, but it was amazing that their friendships with Patsy and what you were able to get out of them and the stories. And wasn't originally when you first started writing it, you were going to write it with her mother, right?
I actually started writing the book with her mother.
Yeah.
Hilda Hensley in Winchester, Virginia. And when Charlie told me I should look up her mother, I said, her mother? He said, well, Patsy died in 1963. She was only 30. And there was only like 12 years difference, I think, between.
Wow.
There's a long story about Patsy Cline and her mother, and I'll leave it to people to read the book because maybe it's not the time and place for it now. But Patsy was actually born 2 days after her mother got married, which was really not the case, but that's the way they had planned it.
Yeah. Didn't she find all this out when she was like trying to get a driver's license or something? She'd done a little bit of research. Yeah. Boy, talk about a surprise.
Yeah.
Whoops. But that was kind of life she lived. It really was. It's just incredible. And like I said, I mean, I've got to sit.
Let me go back to something you just said,
Yeah.
because that is the way the people in that area live.
Yeah.
And I started interviewing Bill Peer and his wife and some of the people that knew Patsy when she was in his band. They thought nothing about trading wives and trading girlfriends, and they'd get married for a couple of years and they'd switch wives, and somebody else would marry the person that he was married to. And quite often, according to some of the band members in Bill's band, there were several people in the band who had been married to each other's wives.
Wow. Wow. Were you a big fan of Patsy Cline before you decided to write the book?
I only knew who Patsy Cline was because of Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
I booked entertainment for 2 years as activities director, or whatever they wanted to call it back then, on the campus at Ole Miss. And I came up with an interesting way to save money. I was working for a theatrical agency here one summer, and they handled Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, we couldn't afford Peter, Paul, and Mary, even though they hadn't hit #1 yet, for one school. So I came up with the idea of trying to book it and three or four other artists into 4 schools night after night. And that's how I met Johnny Cash on the Johnny Cash Cavalcade. Patsy had been working on the cavalcade with Cash and June Carter, but it had been like 3 or 4 months since she had left. But that's how, when I first saw the Johnny Cash Cavalcade with Paul Perkins and all the great Johnny Cash gang, Patsy was still with them. So I never really became a good acquaintance of hers or a friend of hers, but
Yeah.
I had some interaction with her. She and June were very, very close, and June was the first person to start telling me a lot about Patsy Cline. And
Oh
then
wow.
Brenda Lee came into the picture. Brenda, is still going,
Yeah.
and she's been a big fan of the book, and I thank God every day for that. She and her husband Ronnie Shacklett, they're great people, and Brenda sat down with me for hours telling stories. She met Patsy when she was 12 years old. She
Wow.
had gotten stranded on a date in Texas that Patsy was also on. Turned out that the guys that she had been riding with were all boozing it up and playing, pokering it up. And she thought she was lost and left. Her mother had to go back to Nashville because her father was going in the hospital. So when Patsy came out of the theater, or I guess it was the theater and the nightclub or whatever, she ran into Brenda crying, and so Brenda also told her that the promoter refused to pay her. Well, this was Patsy Cline territory. She said, "What are you talking about?" That's one of the first stories in the book with Brenda. But Patsy took Brenda in hand, found the promoter, made him pay her, and said, "Brenda, in the future, make sure you get your money up front." And then she found George Jones and Mel Tillis and cursed them out for making Brenda think that she was stranded. But they ended up traveling together for a couple of weeks, and Patsy and Brenda became like sisters.
That's amazing. I got to meet Brenda a couple of years ago at the Tennessee Governor's Arts Award, and she received that. And it was her and Little Richard and my mentor, who's the cartoonist in Knoxville, and she was amazing. You think about somebody and she's not very big, obviously, but she just lit up a room, and I just only could imagine the story she could tell.
Not only that, but she and Little Richard were very good friends. And then when Patsy went to Las Vegas for the first time, actually the only time, Brenda had already played out there and had gotten to know Liberace and Elvis. And
Oh,
that's how Patsy Cline met Liberace and Elvis.
that's incredible. Okay, yeah. Okay. And I mean, like I said, this janitor one day had a song for her, and it was Willie Nelson. I love that story too.
I would like to say that in the book, there are many other people who come over really in a big way to me, because they treated me with such grace and
Yeah.
consideration. And the interviews with these people who they didn't know who I was, but being from Mississippi helped me a lot, because I still had some of my mother's personality, and I really put it on pretty strong. But people like Gene Shepard and Jan Howard and
Mhm.
Bill Anderson, I got to, and then for that particular time, Conway Twitty had already passed away, sad to say, but I
Yeah.
had gotten to know Conway Twitty, and he told me some stories also before he passed away. Uh, One of the reasons the book, I think, has been in print for so long is that many of the people that I interviewed either died not long after or they refused to be interviewed by the first copycat biographer. So,
Oh yeah.
and the photographer, Les Leverett, I met him when I was coming out of the Nashville City Auditorium during a fanfare event. And I went to the Piccadilly Cafe to get something, cafeteria to get something to eat. And there was like one seat. So I said to this man, I said, do you mind if I sit here? He said, no. He said, you're not from here. I said, no, sir. He said, what are you doing here? I told him what I was doing. He said, well, I'm the WSM Grand Ole Opry photographer. You have to come out to our house tomorrow. I got a lot of pictures I can show you. That's how things happen.
Yeah.
And then one door opened another door.
Okay, so look, I think this is a good point to start with. You mentioned, you were just a guy from Mississippi, and you grew up in Vicksburg. You were born, in the 40s, and you grew up during that time, and you didn't play football, and you didn't, but you loved going to the movies, and you
I
wanted.
worked at the reason I didn't play football is because I was working popping corn at
Yeah, so
night in the movie theater.
well, you were. I mean, that's the thing, and that's one of the things I love about your stories because you were a kid with a dream. You wanted to work for the New York Times. You wanted to make movies. You wanted. I mean, you were totally fascinated in entertainment, and I'd imagine anybody that you said that to in Vicksburg probably said patted you on the head and said, "Oh, that's nice," but you did it, and that's what's so great about your story.
Marshall, I don't think that I know that my father was never quite sure of what I did for a living until long after I guess I was working for MCA Universal at that when I,
Mhm.
came home more regularly. But when I was at the New York Times, he thought it was a communist newspaper, so he wasn't that impressed that I was working there. But there were people in Vicksburg. There was an alderman by the name of O.J. Borey, a
Mhm.
great. I think that he went to mass when there weren't even any masses at the Catholic Church, and the manager of the movie theater who had been letting me come in free since I was like 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
These people, and there was a woman by the name of Evelyn Abraham. She had a kind of a hard hitting, harsh husband, but he turned out to be milquetoast. But Evelyn was one of these people that you knew the moment she died, she went straight to heaven. She was good and took care of everybody. And as I got older, I found out that her life was pretty miserable and
Oh,
helping people made her feel better about herself.
wow.
But people like that said, don't believe what all these people are telling you. Do what you think you want to do. And so I did it. My father finally came to understand that I was making some money at one point, so he was happy.
Well, I mean that's the thing. Your dad was a hardworking guy. He was a butcher. He was a grocer. He got out there every day, and he was gone before the sun came up and came home late. But they didn't
My
have a ton
brother
of.
and sister and I only saw him on Sunday mornings
Yeah.
because he went to open the store and then he was down at the domino parlor right after that.
Well, I mean, but he didn't have a ton of money, I guess, unless he did really well at Domino's that day. But they didn't have a ton of money to send you to school, so
Well,
you went.
at that particular time,
Yeah.
my brother and sister and I think for a long time, my mother didn't realize that he was down at the Crowley Smokehouse gambling.
Yeah.
Uh, but during my 20-minute break at the Strand Theater, I would go down to the smokehouse because they had the most incredible hamburgers for 25 cents. And I saw my dad and all his buddies playing dominoes, and I noticed they were slapping money around. So when Daddy came home Daddy had already lost his grocery store. So when he was working as a guard on the Mississippi River for the towboats, when he
Mhm.
came home with lots of food, we knew he had done some money.
You before you went to Ole Miss, I mean, you went down and worked on the coast. You saved up the
I
money.
did Pascagoula. Yeah, I
Yeah.
worked for my cousin Philip Mitchell, who had the Buick dealership there. So that's how I kind of finally had my first experiences owning a car for 3 months and learning how to really drive a car.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just love. I mean, like I said, I just love your story because, like I said, it was just pure hustle, and you were working. You worked at the resorts, and I think that's probably where you learned your ability how to talk to people and how to get people to open up because you were kind of in the service business, weren't you?
Where I'm trying to think there was a very famous hotel where the big shopping mall is between Gulfport and Biloxi.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the name will come back to me too late.
Yeah.
Uh, but at that hotel, they taught us how to talk to all the tourists who were coming down
Oh,
from the
wow.
north.
Hmm.
There were special trains that would bring them down to Edgewater Gulf,
Okay.
which was which was owned by the same company that owned the Edgewater in Chicago. So very rich people were coming down to Biloxi, and of course they put us through a training to teach us how to talk to them, how to get extra tips out of them, and that's what we were basically living on. Now, I was lucky because on the other side of the hedge, at the end of the property, my cousins Laurel and her mother, they had this beautiful home that they built when one of their relatives was killed in World War II.
Mhm.
When they saw the dormitory where they were putting us up and the mold and mildew in the shower, they moved me to their house. So I was really lucky. I had a luxury bedroom, and all I had to do was crawl through the hedges to go to work every day.
When you went up to Ole Miss, and you mentioned your work booking bands and so forth, which, like I said, I love looking backwards now at your life. All the pieces fit, they fit, and everything makes sense to where you are now, and what you do and what you love to do. You were in journalism as well. And what were there professors there that really helped you and guided you and helped push you toward to what you're doing today?
Well, there was one professor who I thought was really a great guy, and but I was working in the cafeteria three meals a day, so I was always late getting to and those days the journalism school was in an old house on the railroad tracks, and it had a wraparound porch. Well, I knew that if he would lock the door so I couldn't get in.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of the classmates who had a big crush on him. She really liked me, and she tried to make him feel sorry for me, which didn't work. But I would come around on the other side of the porch, and I would work the knob, and she would just get up and let me in. And she said, "Don't forget, he has to work to go to this school."
Oh, wow.
But the person that guided me and really became a mentor to me was the head of the journalism department.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and now that funny how you remember people so well, and yet as you get older, all of a sudden a name escapes you. But a name that doesn't escape me is Ed Meek, who I'm
Yeah.
sure you must know.
Oh, yeah.
Ed was a couple of years ahead of me, but we became very quick, fast friends. And Dean Talbert,
Dean Talbert. Yeah.
he decided he wanted to have an arts magazine. And everybody thought he was crazy and that we were crazy for wanting to work for him. But he put me in charge of selling ads. And I was running the movie committee then. And one of the members of the committee, her father ran Southland Oil. So I got an ad through her for the magazine. We were moving. We had a full page ad. And we decided the first issue had to be really good. So I somehow found out how to reach, oh God, am I going to have another blank? The famous actress from Hot Coffee, Mississippi. Uh, and she gave us the first cover.
Nice.
And then Ed said, "Why don't we try to get Mr. Faulkner to give us something?" So Ed and I went out to Roanoke. We knocked on the door, and lo and behold, he opened the door and said, "What do you want?" So he saw Ed's camera. He said, "No photographs." And Ed said, "Well, we're doing an arts magazine." He said, "At Ole Miss?" And we said, "Yes." And we wondered if you would be a cover story for us and maybe give us a short story that never got printed. He said, "Y'all come on in." Well, the next day we went back out there, Ed with his three cameras, and we went out in the back 40. And with his stable guy, Ed shot Faulkner for at least 40 minutes on his horses. And it turned out to be an incredible cover story. And he then took me up and opened a trunk and said, "Let me see and find something that hadn't ever been done, had never been submitted." So that
Wow.
was the second issue.
Okay. So at that
I
point, you
don't
had
think I
learned
don't think that I don't think that was a third.
that is absolutely incredible. And also, too, it should teach everybody never be afraid to ask.
And you know something? He couldn't have been nicer. He actually offered us food and Coca-Colas, but we were afraid he was going to be drunk or something.
Yeah.
The next time I saw Mr. Faulkner, he was in the town square handing out pamphlets for the election for the county to go wet. He didn't succeed, unfortunately.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know. The day that they started selling cold beer in the convenience stores, I thought that the world was going to start spinning and we'd fly into space. I was like, I never saw that. It's interesting you mentioned about Dean Talbert because my son has a scholarship named after him, which I think is really cool. That so his legacy lives on up at Ole Miss.
Definitely. And do you know, I don't think you know this, but one of the subdivisions of the collection at Ole Miss that I donated in memory of my
Yeah,
parents, it's named after Dean Talbert. And also Tom Hine, who was the dean of activities that I drove to his probably an early grave.
that you working with activities though, that really got you launched. And when you graduated, you went to Columbia for graduate school. And once
Yes.
again, I mean, what drove you to Columbia? Obviously, that's about as good a place as you can go for journalism, of course. And
That's what Dean Talbert said. And then it turned out that one of my instructors was the metropolitan editor of the New York Times, and he liked some of the stories I wrote. And he said, "Come on in, let's see if we can get you." But at that particular point,
yeah,
I also knew uh, McCandlish Phillips.
okay.
He was the tall. I guess McCandlish had to be 6'3", 6'4", like a beanpole. He was one of those great New York, World War II correspondents.
Oh, yeah.
The Times sent him down to Ole Miss to cover the Meredith integration, and
Yeah.
he arrived on the day that the riots happened and the tear gas was blazing all over the place. I was coming down from a meeting with Dick Wilson in the ASB office and ran Smike Bev out the back door into McCandlish, and he said, "Where the heck am I? Can you show me around?" And so I did, and he gave me some money. I said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "Well, I want you to be my runner for a couple of days." And so when he got all his stories and left to go back, he said, "If you're in New York sometime," he said, "look me up. I'll give you a tour of the Times." So I said, "Well, I one of my instructors uh, was the metropolitan. It turned out that I had a double whammy because then one of my instructors was also the metropolitan editor of the paper. But on that tour, he ended up taking me into Turner Catledge's office.
Yeah.
I had no idea that the managing editor of the New York Times was from Philadelphia, Mississippi. And turned out that he had dated my cousin Laurel, who I was telling you about between Gulfport and Biloxi. And he said, "I want you to tell your cousin Laurel I send my love." And he said, "McCandlish tells me you want to work for the New York Times." I said, "Well, I've been telling people that since I was in the fifth grade." He said, "Well, you can start tomorrow." And I said, "Well, I'm going back to Mississippi. I'm going to be Woody Asap's assistant as a weatherman on WLBT." He said, "Oh, no, no, there's a phone over there. Call your parents and tell them you're staying." And that's how that started. And of course, I thought I was starting at the top since I had written for the Mississippian and for the Vicksburg paper. I started as a copy boy, as everybody did back in those
Yeah.
days.
But I mean, and I don't think a lot of people realize that too. Back then, to get to the New York Times, you had to work at a bunch of papers and work your way up. You didn't just start right out of school. So for you, even to start as a copy boy on that was pretty fortuitous to say the least.
It was also very interesting to find out that Abe Rosenthal
Yeah.
and the city there. Oh my God, Gelb, Arthur Gelb on the Metropolitan desk. They started the same thing, the same way I started,
Oh, cool.
which was interesting. So
Yeah.
you're right. Everybody came up ranks, and then I was very impressed to find out that there were 3 or 4 Mississippians working at the New York Times.
Well, that's because Mississippians are everywhere.
They're everywhere.
That's right. I mean, I was walking
Uh,
down the street of London and ran into people from my hometown. So it's just
there
that's
you go.
yeah. You can't get away with anything. That's the
And
thing.
I can remember when I first came to New York, people thought I was from England. And when I said, "No, I'm from Mississippi," they said, "Well, that's interesting. Those accents are similar." I said, "They are?" And then first time I got to go to London, I found out they were right.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. It's an interesting point. Talk about Turner Catledge. When I was in Texas, working right out of literally one of my first jobs in newspapers, my editor was from Philadelphia, Mississippi. His name's Dan Turner, and he's related to Turner Catledge. And so that's how I ended up here is because I was out in San Diego, and he called me one day and he said, "Yeah, the cartooning position's open in Mississippi." And I went, the number you have reached has been disconnected, and I hung up on him. And he called me up again. He said, no, you love Mississippi. It's great. So it's amazing how there's 2 degrees of separation when it comes to Mississippi.
And that's how we have all those fabulous political cartoons you've done. Have you ever put them all into a book?
I have, and I'll have to make sure I get you a copy of it.
Well, if you're going to do that, I'll make sure you get a copy of Honky Tonk Angel.
Well, that is more than a fair
Is that
trade.
a good trade-off?
Yeah, that's a great trade there. So
My friend Susan Yerger in Vicksburg,
Mhm.
she's been sending me your cartoons from years.
Oh, that is awesome. That to me, that's as good as hanging in the Louvre, right there. Is when people share your work. That's great.
The only thing I don't like is when people buy a book and they keep sharing with all their friends.
Well, yeah. Then there's that. It's like no. You need to buy several copies. That's how I make my.
It's very interesting that most of the younger people, when the book first came out and it was a pulp paperback, they ended up buying several copies of the book because some of the letters they sent me, they would say, I've already worn my mother's copy out and now I've worn my copy out. This is the third book we bought. So thank God for loyal fans. And God, there were a lot of loyal fans.
It's a great, I mean, the book is so well reviewed by readers and by reviewers as well. But I think the thing that's really helped you is not only is it a great book, but also that Patsy Cline's just so timeless.
She is timeless. You're right. Yes.
Yeah. And it's something about, number one, I've got a friend who's a drummer for a rock band that I went to high school with. And I'm like, don't get in small planes.
Right.
Yeah.
So true. So true.
So just don't do that. That was such a tragedy. I think Marty Stewart's got some of her memorabilia, if I remember correctly.
If he doesn't, I don't know how he missed out on it because he's got everything else.
Yeah.
I don't know. Has Marty officially opened his museum in Philadelphia? I haven't heard from Marty in a while.
Yeah.
The photographer I was telling you about, Les Leverett,
yeah,
he's like Marty's grandfather.
Yeah.
That's how I got to know Marty really
Okay.
well.
Yeah. His Marty's cousin I worked with for a long time and everything. What a treasure he is too. Good grief. And I mean, I can sit there and watch him play mandolin all day long on that. But
yes.
Yeah, I may be speaking totally out of turn, but I think he has a pair of her boots.
I wouldn't be surprised because that is one thing she had a lot of.
Yeah.
The things that her mother made, everything Patsy wore, with very few exceptions, the furs being one, her mother made for her.
Really?
And it was so sad to see all those costumes just getting auctioned off. And Charlie was a darn multi-millionaire from all of her royalties.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I just can't afford to buy all those costumes. And I thought to myself, well, what type of husband of Patsy Cline are you when you can't even try to have a tribute to her? You know what was interesting about Charlie, and I don't mind saying it today because they haven't been too nice to me, is every single time in Winchester or Nashville, when anyone tried to do anything to honor Patsy, he would put a stop to it somehow. It always had to be about him.
Yeah.
And as horrible a human being as he was to Patsy, even though I know that they did love each other and they were probably cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
I tell people, how can you really love him so much? And they always say the same thing. He's our conduit to Patsy Cline.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He never changed, unfortunately. He treated Hilda like a dog.
Really?
She didn't get a penny after Patsy died. And, it's such there's so many things that are sad about that family, but
yeah, so
we'll let that lie.
Yeah, now I was gonna say they had 2 kids too, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And Julie, who was about 4 when Patsy died, she kind of runs the estate today because Charlie did pass away, I think, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And then the son Randy has kept way out of the limelight, and he's a musician in Nashville.
Oh,
and
wow.
Oddly enough, I have been told that he loves my book. And I know Hilda had problems with my book, but she did read it. And she told this gentleman who got pretty close to her, who was a fan of the book, that at least I tried to tell the truth.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, there was you didn't sugarcoat anything. There was.
I actually did. I sugarcoated a lot.
Oh, did you?
I don't think it shows.
Yeah. Okay.
No, there were things. It's very interesting. Julie and I I don't have a problem with Julie, except, the estate just seems to hate me. And I don't know why. I didn't put anything in that book that I wrote. I interviewed 125 people who signed documents saying that what they gave me was accurate.
Yeah.
Uh, but I kept a lot of things out of the book because Julie and Randy were very young when the 1981 book came out, and I thought certain things didn't need to be said.
Yeah. When you were in Columbia, you went to New York Times, and I loved the way you worked your way up from copy boy. You were talking about sermons to then covering, I mean, just weddings and all kinds of things. But then you were covering the UN, so you covered a wide gamut of things while you were at the New York Times. How did you end up from there to MCA, which I thought MCA turned out to be a fantastic job for you because it really did open a lot of doors for you as well.
Just like just like so many things in my life, perhaps in yours too, totally by accident. But I want to go back to the Times for a minute
Sure.
because I learned everything I know about being a writer from those World War II
Oh,
correspondents
I
that I
bet.
sat next to on rewrite.
Yeah.
I learned That's how I learned to do a story by getting the information from some guy on site over the telephone, and then they would snatch the page out. In those days, everything had to be triple, and they would just snatch the pages out, and then author or somebody at the they'd start rewriting it or telling you what you need to do. But that was a great education. But working with Kitty Telch, who
Hmm.
was also a World War II correspondent
Yeah.
at the United Nations, Kitty she gave me a complete education about international politics, and she let me sit in on many of the meetings
Yeah.
that I wouldn't have been able to sit in on. And I got to sit in the New York Times cubicle many times during the General Assembly. So my 3 or 4 years over there were instrumental in my career, in my opinion.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah,
I
but the
also met I also met people from around the world in the cafeteria.
right. So, I mean, once again, a boy from Vicksburg is now literally, getting to meet and talk to people from around the world. I just love that. I mean, it's just such a great story.
Well, the transition from New York Times to MCA was due to a someone that I didn't know who he was,
Mhm.
but his name is Bob Crew. I think Bob has passed away now. Bob was very instrumental in Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and he's featured in the musical Jersey Boys, maybe even in the film. Uh, when the 1965, 64, 65 World's Fair closed, Bob decided he wanted to redo his triplex apartment on Fifth Avenue. And he came out to the fair and as they were starting to demolish the pavilions, and he bought literally everything. And that's how he recreated his triplex. And someone contacted me and said, sounds like a good story. So I got the story and it ran on the front page of the real estate section, but they ended up syndicating it too. And it turned out that Bob Crew had a press agent by the name of Dick Birch. And Dick contacted me and said, are you happy at the New York Times? And I said, this is my dream job, but I'm never going to get to do what I really want to do here. And he said, well, what do you really want to do? I said, I always wanted to work in the entertainment business.
Mhm.
I said, I always dreamed about working out in Hollywood, all that stuff that never really happened. He said, we have an opening at Universal Studios. Well, my head started spinning. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be out in California. I'm going to be on the
Yeah.
lot of a real movie studio. Turned out that I was on Park Avenue in a 2x4 office, but I
Yeah.
was the director of artist relations. So I had to handle all the stars when they came through for premieres and all of that. And plus, I got to go out to the studio 3 or 4 times a year. And I was always treated very nicely. And it turned out that I got to know the right people from the commissary of all places and staying in the old Sheraton Hotel, which at that time was on the Universal lot. Uh, so somebody came up with the idea of why don't we try to honor Mae West? So I said, well, we've got all these albums of the movie soundtracks she did. Why don't we take some of her famous one-liners and put it? And that's how I got to meet Mae West. And
Wow.
we staged a gala event that took place in two of the huge sound stages. She would not, of course, she wanted $25,000 to participate. They found it somehow.
Yeah.
which, at that, when you think 1970, $25,000 was a lot.
You could buy a house.
This was also still a big name.
Yeah.
And she said that she would only do it if she could come in a white Rolls Royce. And so I started, where the hell am I going to get a white Rolls Royce? Well, a couple of days later, some press agent took me to lunch at, oh gosh, again, I'm forgetting the name, Ma Maison,
Yeah.
which at that time was the hot Beverly Hills restaurant. And when we arrived, I saw a white Rolls Royce in the parking lot. So when I went in, I very politely asked the maitre d', who owns that Rolls Royce? And it, let's see if I can maybe remember who it was now. It was, it was owned by the English actor who was one of the co-stars of Cabaret, the movie. You're going to have to help me out here.
Oh, yeah.
But at any rate, I had the nerve to go over to him and ask him if there was any chance we could rent his Rolls Royce. And he said, well, for what event? I said, and I told him about the Mae West event that was coming up very quickly. And he said, well, yeah, if you let me drive the car. And I said, well, it's your car. We can't prevent that. So that's how we got the white Rolls Royce for her to make her appearance in.
Once again, you weren't afraid to ask.
I wasn't afraid to ask, but I'm sorry that I'm afraid I can't remember his
Oh,
name.
no.
He was a big, big name at the time, too. He was the male lead of Cabaret. And it's hard to say the last time I saw him. I'm sorry?
No, I'm just going to I'm going to do what everybody does now. I'm going to look on my phone.
Okay.
We're going to look it up. So
he came to one of the Cabaret anniversaries here. And sorry to say, I think that he had cancer of the jaw. And I remembered he was probably one of the most handsome men in the world.
Yeah.
And it was so sad to see him in that condition. But that's life, isn't it?
It does tend to.
We all get old.
Let's see here.
I'm going to be so embarrassed when you tell me his name.
Let's see. Oh, here's the
cast of Cabaret the movie.
Joel Grey, Michael York.
Michael York.
Yeah, I was thinking
Gray's,
it was.
By the way, Joel Grey is my neighbor down the street.
Really?
He's a pretty friendly guy most of the time.
I
interviewed Joel probably more than I interviewed anyone through the years, but he has no idea who I am.
Oh, wow.
But, Marshall, it was interesting through the years when I was doing a lot of interviews, people on Broadway. I would usually interview them between matinees on Wednesdays. And on an occasion, they'd be having the Tony Award event or something after the matinee. And I can remember interviewing a couple of people, and I went to say hello to them at the cocktail party, and they didn't know who the hell I was, and I had just interviewed them. So you learn pretty quickly there's no pride in this business.
No. It's like sometimes you're a leaf on a stream in their lives, and you're just kind of
exactly
there in that moment.
Well, that's something that, Marshall, that's something that you learn that most people don't think about. Oh, you knew so-and-so, you knew so-and-so. Well, actually, I interviewed them. They told me what they wanted me to know. They were promoting something. I didn't really know much about them at all. I only knew what they wanted to tell me. So there are rare occasions that I actually became friends with anybody that I interviewed.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you on that because I've got a couple people that I've actually become friends with over the years of doing these type of interviews, one of them I'm about to actually work on a book with. I did a radio interview with him a few years ago, and he came in for the book festival, and he and I are going to work on it. So you do make relationships, but you're right. People are literally coming in with they've got what they're going to say. They don't want you getting inside any further and so forth. But that makes it fun when you're interviewing too, to try to drag stuff out of them they haven't said before.
Well, there certainly were exceptions. Like I certainly think that Loretta Lynn and Brenda Lee, they were a long time. Well, I still think of Brenda as my friend.
Yeah.
But also Cheetah Rivera became
wow.
like a lifelong friend. And Debbie Reynolds, oddly enough, who could be pretty mean sometimes.
Really?
But I had interviewed her a couple of times, and she would kind of ask me for favors occasionally. And when I would come through, I found out that if she asks you for a favor, she's going to be nice to you the next time you see her. So she opened a lot of doors for me. Debbie Reynolds did. Connie Stevens, who it was the big deal to bring Connie Stevens to Ole Miss. and Jackson got wind of it. They wanted to have a parade from the airport. When we were landing at the airport, I wasn't in the plane. When I was at the Jackson airport to meet the plane that Connie was flying in on, there were hundreds of people. They declared a school holiday.
Wow.
And the parade ended up at City Hall, and we ended up. The mayor had a press conference with Connie, and then at Ole Miss, it was tradition that when we would have a name for one of our concerts, we would take them to a sorority or a fraternity, and they would have dinner with the group. And we took Connie. It was Chi Omega's chance. It was not. Excuse me. It wasn't Chi Omega. It was Sigma Chi's opportunity to have one of the stars for dinner, and they named Patsy. They named. Can you believe that they named Patsy? They named Connie Stevens, sweetheart of Sigma Chi. Every time I've seen Connie over the years, she always looks at me and says, "I'm the sweetheart of Sigma Chi."
Oh, that's
She never
awesome.
forgot that. And Julie London, who
Yeah.
didn't have a long life, sad to say, but I really got to know Julie and Bobby Troop, her husband, really well. Bobby taught me a lot about jazz. I didn't know a lot about jazz.
Huh.
So going back to Dick Birch and joining MCA, that's how I met Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber. It was around the time that MCA was distributing The Who, but they didn't own it. They only distributed in the United States. So MCA kind of really needed a strong. It was at the time of The Who had the Tommy rock opera. They wanted a rock opera. So here come Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber with the rock opera about Jesus. So I ended up working with them from the first single through the launch, and then luckily I got to work with Tom O'Horgan and the casting director for Broadway and the tour, and then the Los Angeles production. So I'm still, I would, I call myself a good friend of Tim Rice's. I wouldn't say that about Andrew, but I would say Andrew at least is a vague acquaintance because he became so rich and
Yeah.
so famous and so full of himself that he's above us all.
That's that's something else too that has had an incredible life that and how people look at it differently even today than they did back then. And now you're seeing it on NBC.
It mystified me, and it mystified not only mystified me, but it mystified them because they were taken to hell and back when that record came out.
Yeah.
And today, it's like tradition in churches and everything today.
I know it. I mean, literally, it's on network television. They do it live. Do a live performance on that.
That was probably that live performance on NBC was probably one of the very best ever.
I thought so too.
They were very happy. Tim and Andrew were really happy about that one.
Yeah. So I thought Sarah Bareilles was just incredible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She is incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. What a voice. I mean, I could listen to her sing the phone book and it probably would be enjoyable.
That's true of so many people in the business too.
I know.
I always said that I could listen to Christian Chenoweth sing the songbook, the telephone book, and the songbook too. I guess
we were binge watching The West Wing, which is these days it's kind of comforting in a strange way to watch it because it seems so normal.
Yeah.
But she was on there. She was on the show, and she was really young, and it was just like, oh wow. And I was telling my boys who she was. I said, okay, you remember Wicked? Remember when they went to go see Wicked? She, and then on that, she's just so incredibly gifted. And that's been the beauty of your career is that you've just gotten to meet and talk to so many incredible people. One thing I've discovered and this is a lot of it's through the cartooning world too, is that the really, really talented people, a lot of times they're actually pretty nice. I mean, they're actually decent people. Because they don't really have anything. They're not trying to prove anything to you. Do you find that?
I think that's very true. Yeah, because some of those people who are some of the people that you just talked about, they have remained friends through the years, and I support them, and they're always very, they're very appreciative of anything you do. Debbie could be very demanding sometimes, but when she did a major event for a charity and I wrote about it, she was always very appreciative of that. And Debbie's husband, the last one, I think, he was a friar. That's one of those, there used to be one of those show business private, like clubs.
Yeah.
it's open mainly to business people today. She always wanted to be a friar. So when she came to New York to appear at the Carlisle Hotel, I made it my business to contact the friars to see if we couldn't make her a friar. And it became a big event, much
Oh,
bigger than anybody expected. And I kind of got, they tried to push me out of the way. In fact, I was going to be the one to interview her and everything at the reception. They
yeah.
said, well, we'd like to have so and so come in and interview her. And she said, no, no, no. She says, if it wasn't for Ellis, I wouldn't be getting this. He'll interview me.
That's
So
awesome.
same things like that surprise you sometimes, and you appreciate that. It's like with Kelly Barfield. She doesn't have to keep my book in stock, but God bless her. She keeps books by Mississippians in stock at the Lorelei bookstore, and she is so supportive of writers. And it's great that Vicksburg has such a fantastic bookstore.
Yeah,
And
Lorelei's amazing. I have enjoyed. I always love going over and signing books there, and like I said, Mississippi has such a great tradition of independent bookstores, and we're very blessed here.
and a great tradition of writers.
Yes.
You may recall that Mark Crowley was a Vicksburger. He
Hmm.
was about 5 years ahead of me, but I got to know him through the movie theaters. And when Mark ended up moving to New York from the West Coast, we ended up running into each other, and for the first time, we actually became friends.
Uh,
And I must have interviewed Mark. I interviewed Mark so many times that when people wanted to interview him, he'd say, "Well, you can do that if Ellis Nassour can do the interview." And
oh,
he told me everything I needed to know, but he knew that I would treat him fairly.
yeah.
And
This will.
I got a lot of flack when the Clarion Ledger was very brave
Mhm.
to print an interview I did with him about his play about being molested by a priest when he was very, very young. Uh, and the Clarion Ledger stood behind the article. They stood behind me, and they said, you don't live here. You don't have to put up with these idiots.
Since this is airing on September 11th, is when it will debut.
Ah,
Um, that you were there. You were there that day in New York. You witnessed everything firsthand. Tell us a little bit about what you saw.
well, one of my neighbors on the fifth floor here was the actress from Paris, Tennessee, Cherry Jones,
Hmm.
and her girlfriend Mary O'Connor was an architect, and Mary needed to have something to promote her being an architect to get her some business. So they asked me if I would be okay to have a roof garden built over my apartment. And I said, no, no way. They said, well, we're going to come and see what we have planned. So they built it over three steel beams, which made it sort of acceptable. Didn't quite turn out that way. But we spent a lot of time up there. And on September the 11th of 2000, right?
2001. Yeah.
2001, Mary and Cherry's mothers were visiting here, and we were up on the roof in the roof garden having breakfast. And it was Cherry's mother who said, "That plane is flying very low over the river, and the Hudson River is like a block down the street, and we have an unobstructed view from here." And we didn't think too much of it. And then a few minutes later, she said, "That building's on fire." From my roof garden, I had a fantastic view of at least three-quarters of the towers.
Oh, wow.
So I'm only 15 blocks from the towers. So we saw all of this transpiring. And then the telephone started ringing and people were calling saying, "Is your television on?" We said, "We're watching it. We're seeing it happen."
Yeah.
Uh, and I guess hours later, Sherry and I thought she still to this day is a big bicyclist. She said, "Why don't we bicycle over to St. Vincent's Hospital and see if we can be of any help?" At that point, they had turned St. Vincent, which is on 7th Avenue and 12th Street at that time, into a triage for the
Hmm.
victims of the towers. Well, no ambulances ever came.
Yeah.
And Kathleen Turner and Meryl Streep lived across the street from St. Vincent on 12th Street,
Hmm.
not in two or three brownstones apart. They were there to also help. So that's how they knew who Cherry was. I didn't know who they were, but
Yeah.
that's how I got to know them. And we stood there for 4 or 5 hours. No ambulance ever came because the fuel from the airplanes just incinerated everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Vicksburg Post asked me if I would write an article about that. And I think it was a 2-part piece. And it got syndicated by the AP, which was, of course, that was a great blessing.
Yeah. No, that definitely was. And
But
that just had to
if
be
I can answer any, I mean, like, thank God the winds were blowing in the opposite direction, because we would have been covered with ash
yeah.
all up the way. Yeah.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, watching it from here, the uncertainty was off the charts. I can't even imagine sitting there and watching it live and hearing it and smelling it and all your senses engaged. Because, like I said, television just makes everything like you're looking through a toilet paper tube. You don't really get a sense of the and I can't even imagine just sitting there and watching the horror of the buildings burn and collapse.
It was just mind-boggling to us that these airplanes could even do that.
Yeah.
And the fact that the airplanes couldn't fly through the building stunned me. I figured at the speed they were going, they were going to go right through the buildings, but that never happened, which shows the buildings were pretty well constructed.
Yeah. Oh,
and the only thing is that the way the buildings collapsed showed, I think, that the buildings were pretty well constructed.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they took the lick that they did and stayed up as long as they did to allow the people to get out,
that is so true.
Amazingly,
thousands did get out, which is another gift from God. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember we had a couple of Mississippi congressmen were in for an editorial board meeting, and this was literally 2 days after it. And they were saying, there was going to be 10 to 15,000 people dead. It turned out much lower, but it was still astronomical. I mean, it was still such a huge tragedy. But like I said, the fact that people, and also too, because it was an election day, because, a lot of people were running late, there were just so many stories like that. But, and thank you for sharing that though. And because, I mean, like I said, it's so hard to believe that I just moved my oldest son into his apartment for his first job out of college. And he was in a high chair watching that, so that just tells you that time has passed very quickly and that there's a lot of people that have no real memory of it. We went up to New York and I took them to the museum, which is incredibly powerful.
It is very powerful. And not everybody, it's not something for everybody. I'll have to say that, but it is very powerful. Yes.
Yeah. I could imagine if you were there, it would be hard just for PTSD reasons to go in and on it. But, as we were going through the security, I just turned around and looked at my kids and said, this is the true monument to 9/11, because, our world totally changed and we had to do that. But
what you said earlier about the fact that it's so much in our memory, and every year, of course, here they celebrate it by doing all the names, and babies at one time are now the grandchildren who are reading the name.
Yeah.
So they kept the tradition alive. I don't know if those naming of names is ever going to stop. Because you figure at some point that's going to fade out, but who knows when that'll be.
I know because I remember, people remember Pearl Harbor or remember where you were when JFK was shot, then obviously then time.
Good examples, very good examples, Marshall. Yeah. Yes.
So obviously I'm very sensitive to your time and we've covered a good chunk of your career.
You are? I devoted my entire day to going to the doctor and to being with you. I would like to mention,
if I could get there with you going to the doctor, then I've done pretty well, because I know that's a pretty important trip.
I would like to just mention that in January, my book, which is like a complete revision of the rock opera book from 1973, Jesus Christ Superstar, is coming out in a deluxe edition. And I've had incredible cooperation from Tim Rice and so many of the people who were in the movie and in the Los Angeles production. And Tom O'Horrigan when he passed away, his partner, Mark Cohen, donated the entire Tom O'Horrigan archive to Boston University. And he gave me complete access to that. So I've uncovered photographs that no one even knew existed and color slides of the different productions. So it's going to be, we hope, another collector's edition book.
Well, that was going to be my first question. You're obviously still out there getting it done, still writing, still enjoying it, and
No,
staying
it's
going.
done. It's
Yeah,
just that because of COVID and because of an editor that left and then came back, and the new editor having maternity leave, uh, the book got pushed from November to January. Those things happen, and
yeah.
they've got. It's very interesting today. Most editors, they don't have a lot of associates anymore. My particular editor has 5 books on his plate at the same time, and I
Yeah.
don't think that would be very easy.
Yeah, there's supply chain issues on every level of every job, it seems like, and that the publishing and of course the newspaper business. I mean our worlds have totally changed from the time that you.
Totally,
Yeah,
totally, yeah.
yeah, it,
It is amazing though when you walk in a Barnes and Noble and you see all those displays and all those books, and they haven't given up on books yet. So that's great.
I think books are special, and I think if books are events, and that's now obviously Honky Tonk Angel was an event, and that's why it's lasted for so long. It's something special, and
I've made it into an event, right?
yeah, no, well, let's put it this way: Patsy Cline, for 30 years old, it's hard to believe she just passed her 90th birthday. So literally, she has been dead twice as long as she was alive.
That's
But
right. Yeah.
but what a
And
legacy!
the fanfare, the fans. I mean, she's much more popular today than she was in 1963. It is
Right?
amazing. She's been discovered in so many countries that it boggles my mind. We're going to have a Portuguese edition of the book and a German edition. Uh, and I think that, and also when I was working in the Philippines with Lea Salonga, I found out that they knew who Patsy Cline was over there. And you know what was responsible for people knowing who some of these country artists and American artists were? The
Who's that?
GIs who were
Yeah,
stationed in Asia during World War II. Everything got released to the Armed Forces Network the same time it came to the public. So these guys who were dating native women, they talked about these singers and they played the records and they heard the music. So that's how Patsy Cline is so well known in so many places. And also going back to something else, when Jesus Christ Superstar first came out as the album, it was dead in the water. They couldn't give it away. And there was a nightclub, and I think it was a gay nightclub in the Netherlands. And then there was a concert club in Rio de Janeiro that decided to start playing the Superstar record as a dance record. And that's how the popularity of Jesus Christ Superstar started to catch on. And the album then 3 years later became the best-selling album of all time.
that's incredible. I mean, you love. I mean, I love
There's so
hearing how
many
things.
incredible stories in life, though, Marshall. It's interesting when you read different books and you're just awed at some of the experiences these people had, and they survived them.
Yeah,
And that's what you have to do. Life
yeah.
is not always easy, and there are lots of failures, and you just have to deal with them and say tomorrow's another day.
Well, I think that's probably a very good place for us to wrap up. But you know what? I hope we can do
Let's
this again.
not stop. Let's go. Let's go on for another 2 hours.
No, I'm about to say I do hope that we can do this again soon because I really just have enjoyed talking to you, and I feel like that I just scratched the surface on
You
on
know
on
what
your
would be
career.
nice? Maybe when the Superstar book comes out and you've had a chance to read it and see all the things that have never been known,
Yeah,
that might be a nice time because Jackson, Mississippi is in the Jesus Christ Superstar book because they banned the show. They wouldn't let the concert come to Jackson once, and then it kind of sneaked in once before the church found out about it. Uh, but so Jackson's in there. Yeah, I was able to kind of like go back and trace it and get in touch with someone from the old city auditorium who knew that it's a true story.
that'd be fantastic. We'll do that. We'll just count on that. Ellis, this has been great, and I would just want to note real quick before we go. I want to thank UMC, the University of Mississippi Medical Center, for sponsoring today's podcast. Of course, a lot of great things about them. We'll touch on that a little bit later, but I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, I didn't know that they were a sponsor,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a little secret to tell you. I'm working with them on all the elephant posters all the circus posters I've collected through the years through my contacts with Ringling Brothers and also my elephant collection. And there's going to be a lot of elephant posters in one of the lobbies of the children's annex very soon.
Yay! That's
Uh,
great.
and you know, I didn't give you the full name of the collection at Ole Miss. It's
Yeah.
the Mamie and Ellis Nassour Arts and Entertainment Collection, which started in 2002, was dedicated in 2004, and it has become a massive collection that is archival, that's a section for research, and then a third of the collection circulates in the library for faculty, researchers, and students. I'm very proud of that I was able to donate something that will have a long, long life at Ole Miss.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Ellis, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Marshall. Thank you so much.
This has been fun. All right. Thank you for watching this episode of Mississippi Stories. Make sure to subscribe to the Mississippi Today YouTube channel and click the bell to be notified every time a new video uploads.